Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome and thank you, all of you, to coming to this session under the title of Chaos and Disorder Destined, Search for a New Regional and International Order. As this title implies, we gather at a time of profound global uncertainty. Around the world, we are witnessing multiple crises unfolding simultaneously. The war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, and intensifying major power competition raise questions about the future of the international system. Many observers argue that we are witnessing the gradual erosion of the post-Cold War order. Others suggest that we are entering an era no longer defined by a single dominant framework, but rather by a more complex and fragmented distribution of power and influence. The central question before us today is whether the world is experiencing a temporary period of turbulence or a more fundamental and structural transformation of international order. And we are especially fortunate today to have with us four distinguished former foreign ministers who have been at the forefront of diplomacy and international affairs. So allow me to introduce briefly our esteemed panelists. From my left, the Honorable Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia. He is well known to the world and renowned globally for his contributions to multilateral diplomacy and conflict prevention. And then the Honorable Taro, former Foreign Minister of Japan and a prominent voice on the regional security and international cooperation. And I really appreciate Minister Kono that he already had a previous session. So now he's attending 2 consecutive sessions. So thank you. And then Ambassador Shivshankar MENON, former Foreign Secretary of India. And I think he's one of the most respected strategic thinkers. You will find why I'm saying in this way. And then last but not the least, Dr. Marty NATALEGAWA. He is former Foreign Minister of Indonesia and the leading advocate of ASEAN-centered regional cooperation and always advocate dialogue and diplomacy. So our discussion will begin with opening remarks from each panelist and followed by a moderator-led dialogue. And if time permits, I will also invite questions and comments from the audience. So with that, let me invite our first speaker to begin, the Honorable Gareth Evans. The floor is yours, Gareth.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Testing 1, 2, 3. Well, thank you very much, Sung-hwan, and I look forward very much to our discussion. The present international environment is certainly as chaotic and disorderly and as bleak as any of us can remember. The last decade or more has been a far cry from that environment of cooperation, optimism that did generally prevail in the first 2 decades after the end of the Cold War. We've had enough discussions in the last 2 days to make us all depressed, but just to run through the litany again of what's gone wrong. We've seen an erosion in respect, especially by the biggest powers, Russia, China, the United States, for international law. An erosion of respect for multilateral institutions and processes. In that context, there's been the waging of aggressive war, Ukraine and Iran, militarization of the South China Sea, paralysis in the Security Council, lack of support for key international organizations like UNHCR, World Food Programme, World Health Organization, the collapse of development assistance funding generally, the United States retreat from the WTO and trade coercion adoption by it, There's been a failure of response in so many places to mass atrocity crimes. There's been assaults on the International Criminal Court. There's been a visible weakness of regional organisation responses to human security crises in Africa and Southeast Asia with Myanmar. And there's been a weakness in the collective response to the great existential issues of climate change, pandemics, nuclear holocaust. Nuclear arms control agreements in particular are either dead, dying or on life support. And possibly now we have the new problems associated with artificial intelligence. So what are the main underlying drivers of this rather bleak environment that we've all witnessed? Well, one of them, I think, has been clearly the general absence of effective leadership in too many of the countries that really matter. We've seen the impact of the digital media age in encouraging dumbed-down populism in too many of our countries, making courageous or sophisticated policy responses ever more difficult. And we've also seen, I think, a troubling amnesia, loss of memory, among policymakers and publics as to how military aggression so often ends catastrophically, how peace and prosperity are best ensured by diplomacy and cooperation, finding security with others, not against them. But while the current breakdown may seem structural and may seem depressingly complete, I think there is a chance that it may prove temporary. And I do think that the situation is not a total cause for despair. There is a chance that genuinely recapturing that sense of a stable and secure and prosperous international environment is not a lost cause. I think in this respect there are signs that if the current generation and next generation of political leaders do absorb and apply some of the lessons that are there now to be learned, there is a real chance of a more stable, secure and prosperous future. So what are the lessons which I think should have been learned from these last years? Let me list 7 of them, and that'll be it. First, military might does not necessarily guarantee victory or dominance. Russia found that in Crimea. The United States has certainly found that in Iran. Nor does it guarantee one's own security, as Israel has found in the context of its dominance physically in Palestine. Second lesson, nuclear weapons are simply not the assets that they're so often assumed to be, proving simply not usable in any of the contexts in which they've traditionally been assumed to be determinants. They're not usable as weapons of compellence, as Russia has certainly found in its inability to use its nuclear weapons as any kind of superiority guarantor against Ukraine. They're not effective as weapons of effective deterrence, as Israel has found with its nuclear arsenal, certainly not stopping it from being on the receiving end of assaults from Iran's proxies and, more recently, Iran itself. And, of course, the reality is, as so many of us have said in APLN for so long, that the real threat of nuclear weapons lies in not so much deliberate aggressive use, because I think these lessons are being learned, but in human or system error. So long as any of these weapons exist, there's a real chance they will be used simply by miscalculation or sheer human idiocy. There's a critical need, accordingly, for risk reduction strategies to deal with that reality. And I think that lesson is beginning to come clear again after a period of a collapse of nuclear arms control treaties. The third lesson I think that's being learned is that there is power in competence, that impetuous, irrational, non-evidence-based decision-making, especially to initiate military action, is more likely than not to end in tears. I think it's beginning to be realised that a madman strategy only works if the decision-maker is not actually mad. I think it's beginning to dawn on the US administration that trying to preserve the United States primacy in the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, is really a lost cause, and that a far more intelligent and rational approach than confrontation in dealing with the rise of China is the pursuit of Cold War-style détente. And I think the Xi-Trump summit language of strategic stability we saw emerging a couple of weeks ago is an indication that that way forward is beginning to dawn on both sides of that confrontation, that that's the only way to go. A fourth lesson I think we're learning is that there's power in numbers. As Mark Carney's rallying call at the World Economic Forum made clear, there is a real capacity for the world's middle powers, and all of us really represent them, to step up and make a difference through creative and cohesive, multilateral and minilateral coalition building. For example, in response to trade and economic bullying of the kind that we've seen, with one example of an effective middle power being after the United States walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the recreation of a new version of that as the CPTPP. And we've seen it in the collective pushback against Trump tariffs, with alternative market supply chains being developed. We've seen a degree of cohesion of middle power countries in response to security threats, with the EU and NATO cooperating very effectively, minus the United States' presence in relation to Ukraine. And we've seen minilateral formulations emerging in the Quad and the so-called Squad in our own region, and I suspect there's more such arrangements to come. And we've seen it in support, middle power cooperation of institutions under stress, including financially, when major contributors have walked away. A fifth lesson, I've only got two more to go, there's power, I think, in decency. Soft power really does, I strongly believe, and I think we should agree, really does continue to matter. Being seen to be a good international citizen, not just consumed with self-interest, not just consumed with basic security and economic interests, but committed to what's been described as purposes beyond ourselves. Peacemaking, peacekeeping, atrocity prevention, humanitarian response, human rights, poverty reduction. Doing that sort of stuff really is in every country's national reputational interest. And of course, it does also help in addressing those collective action problems, advancing regional and public, global and regional public goods, including reducing those big existential risks of climate change, pandemics, and nuclear war. Being seen to be the kind of country that's interested in working cooperatively, even there's no immediate return, is the sort of thing that helps get difficult stuff done. The sixth lesson, I think, there is power in honesty. The lesson is beginning to dawn in dealing with the rise of far-right parties that have been so destructive of intelligent policy making in so many of our countries. It's beginning to dawn that attacking corruption, or at least excessive capture by big money, may be the most effective way of challenging poor populist leaderships. That certainly proved to be the case with Orban in Hungary and his overthrow in the recent election, and maybe that money approach, showing the power of honesty and the trouble associated with dishonesty. Maybe Trump, Farage in the UK, Pauline Hanson in Australia will be disbeneficiaries of that particular lesson that I think is beginning to be learned by democratic parties. And my very last point to finish is this. Lesson to be learned is there is simply power in optimism, in staying optimistic. And I really do believe, and I've always believed, that it's crucial for all of us in government and civil society who want to recreate a better regional and global order to stay optimistic. Never stop believing that change is possible. Never stop working for that change. Optimism is self-reinforcing, just as pessimism is self-defeating. Thank you.
Thank you. As always, thank you for your insightful statement. And Kono-san, floor is yours.
Thank you. I guess there's no free lunch. My previous session was for the lunch, and this is for dinner, I guess. Well, when we invited China to WTO, we knew their political system is different. But if they were to become good team player, everyone would benefit. But it didn't turn out that way, unfortunately. They increased their military spending 48-fold in the last 30 years. And they are now using their economy, I mean, they are weaponizing their economy to threat other country when they don't go along with China. Our Senkaku Island has their Chinese gunboat going around Senkaku Island. Our Coast Guard are trying to physically push them out. Our Air Self-Defense Force scramble against Chinese aircraft every day, sometimes twice, 3 times a day. That is a reality. And unfortunately, there's also a big structural change coming from the United States. President Obama has initiated their withdrawal from the global order. President Obama didn't take any action in South China Sea or Syria when someone crossed over the red line. And the President Trump is going extreme. Well, in East Asia, we should have increased our burden sharing. I mean, Japan was quite happy with 1% of military, 1% of GDP for going to the military spending. And we have been relying on the United States too much, too long. And now we are increasing the defense spending to 2% of GDP. And that's something we should have been doing much, much before. Now, same thing is happening in Europe, but Europe, with 30-some countries sitting on one continent, connected by railroad, they could possibly imagine Plan B, Europe without United States. But here in East Asia, Japan is island country. When we run out of ammunition, there's no supply coming through railroad. It has to come from the ship. And there are 55 Chinese submarines going around Japan. And we definitely need to create robust defense industry to defend ourselves. And then Japan has ally in Korea, and then the Philippines, and then Australia and New Zealand a bit far away. So it'll be difficult to imagine Plan B in East Asia. We have to think about Plan A plus. Plus meaning, well, when Ukraine war is over, we would like to see NATO expanding into the Pacific, North Atlantic and the Pacific Treaty Organization, and hoping NATO will change itself from regional organization to some kind of global institution to defend common values. Then Japan needs to change the constitution, establish full-fledged collective security, collective defense to participate in new NATO, I guess. We also need to create some kind of middle power plus global South organization institution. Well, the middle power, I think we first need to earn trust from global South. I think the West has been using double standard for too long. I mean, look at the situation in Gaza, look at the situation in Cox's Bazar, and if we compare that to Ukraine and other situations, we understand that the global South is not really trusting the West or the middle powers in the West. So hopefully we will change ourselves, and if we could create some kind of coalition between middle powers and the global South, we should be able to create United Nations 2.0. It'll be very difficult to change UN Charter. So I think we need to do what the American people did for their constitution. If it's difficult to amend, they adopted the new constitution to supersede the old one. I think that's what we need to do so that we could create a new United Nations without veto power so that those three mega countries cannot veto everything that they don't like. The last one, our self-defense force has failed to recruit people for last so many years. I mean, at the soldiers level, we have been recruiting less than 50% for several years. So definitely, we need to develop some kind of AI soldiers to replace human being. But what we look at, what happened to black box on F-16 in Europe, we cannot 100% rely on United States to develop AI soldiers. And in order to do that, I think we need to get together with Korea, Australia, Philippines, and European country, like-minded country, to co-develop new AI technology so that if United States makes some negative decision towards us, we have at least some root of the technology to hang on to. It'll be a very difficult situation. Alliance with the United States, that's the key to the peace and stability in East Asia. Do we trust the United States 100%? Well, at least we need to pretend to trust United States for now because there is no other alternative. So it'll be a very difficult time and we have to sometimes make hard decisions, but I think that's the reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kono. Yes, as I said, he is now attending 2 consecutive sections. That's why he is talking about no free lunch. But you raised very sensitive questions, cooperation with the NATO in Asia, and also United Nations 2.0, and also trust. To what extent we trust the United States? Anyhow, we'll discuss later. Thank you. And Ambassador MENON, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I thought I'd do is I'll speak very briefly about how I see the present situation, because I know we've heard a lot of negative things for the last 2 days, but it actually, to my mind, doesn't seem that bad. And then a little bit about how we might respond, how we might use the present moment with all its infirmities. I mean, Gareth listed them and frightened the wits out of us. In a sense, what we're seeing now is the world is actually returning to the historical norm. For most of history, there was no world order. This is unusual, what we've seen in the last few centuries. And the hegemon has convinced us that world order is a good thing for everybody. Everybody didn't gain out of the world order. I mean, let's be quite clear. If you look at the condition of developing countries, you look at other places. But what's happening now is a world order depends on a huge imbalance in power. There has to be somebody with huge, preponderant power who actually imposes the order. The Mongol Empire, the British Empire, American hegemony after World War II. Today, there's a much flatter distribution of power in the world. During the Cold War, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, between them, accounted for about 80% of world GDP and about 80% of world military power. Today, well, neither of those really exist as functioning geopolitical organizations. Warsaw Pact's gone. And I'm not sure you can talk of the West as one geopolitical unit anymore. Today, the 2 biggest powers, China and the US, have less than 50% of world GDP and less than 50% of world military power. Power is more evenly distributed. And this is why you see what you see today. Everybody thinks that because of the disorder, that there's geopolitical space for them to try their luck. Russia tries their luck in Ukraine, Rwanda in Democratic Republic of Congo, Israel and the US in Iran, Azerbaijan in Armenia. I mean, wherever you look, everybody thinks, yeah, here's my moment. Because there is no world order actually working to keep them. And because states are, because of great power rivalry, the multilateral system is also ineffective. And so what we're seeing is actually a political fragmentation and a return to a historical norm. And in some ways, if you look at history, some of our most creative periods have actually been periods when there wasn't order. You think of the Axial Age, 6th century BC. You think of early modern Europe. It's 400 years of war. and social and political chaos, French Revolution, etc. And that's when the Industrial Revolution is cooked and made. You look at 10th to 12th century Central Asia. And so we shouldn't get so frightened of the fact that, oh my God, we don't have this Western so-called liberal order anymore to run the world. And there is geopolitical space here which has opened up. I also want to make another point. We tend to confuse the politics and the economics. Frankly, if you look at the proportion of world trade to world GDP since 2011, it's been pretty steady, between about 55 and 58%. We talk of deglobalization, but we're still interdependent economically. The pattern of trade is changing because the US, the power who actually helped to build the system, has opted out of it, has opted out of MFN. You've seen with unilateral tariffs. You've seen the ineffectiveness of the WTO. So you have a pattern that's changing, and you've seen the huge rise of China in the last few years. It's changing the nature of, so you're politically fragmented and disordered, but you're still, the economy is still working in an integrated, there is a globalized economy still at work. And I think we shouldn't forget that. So where are we going? One more sign of hope, if I have to find one, is frankly the war on Iran should have convinced anybody sensible that there are limits to military power, that ultimately you have to go back to political means to deal with these things. You have to turn to the diplomats to get you out of the mess that you've created. And frankly, if people learn that lesson, that ultimately this is all political and that there are limits to the use of military power, I think it would have been a net contribution to us all. But so where do we go? How do we deal with this situation? We've heard people talk of an Asian CSC, for instance. Frankly, I think that's far too ambitious. Even if you exclude West Asia, which has particular problems of its own, I think it's very difficult to see an Asian CSC or anything like that. My answer is actually issue-based coalitions of the willing and able. Because you're dealing with a fragmented and a much flatter distribution of power, it seems to me that you need to turn to those who have the capability and those who are willing to do so to deal with the issues that really matter to you. And it's quite clear what matters to us. In these parts of Asia, it's certainly maritime security would be way up there. But we also need to guarantee that we can keep the peace that we've had since the Vietnam War in Asia, east of West Asia, that we've managed. And that's what's led to our prosperity, our rise, our growth. To my mind, we need to look back to what brought that peace, what kept that peace. I have a simple answer. It's not the answer that makes people happy. The balance of power. And I think we are now actually in a situation where the power is more balanced. We're still learning to deal with this phenomenal rise in Chinese power, which is being weaponized, as we've just been reminded. But the balance of power, and the other thing, frankly, was the balance of terror. Nuclear weapons were never war-fighting weapons. And they were not meant for the entire range of the spectrum of violence. You don't kill a mosquito with a nuclear weapon. You know, it doesn't make sense. Nuclear weapons were meant to neutralize other nuclear weapons and deterrence. And frankly, that's worked. There's been a taboo against use since 1945. And that is where it remains and should remain. And I don't think we need to drag that and complicate the rest of our lives. But we need to make sure that that balance of terror remains. I know it's a bad thought, and that the balance of power also still works. And that's what we've seen in Asia. If you look at it at East Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, you look at what we've done. For the last 15 years, we've developed relations, defense, security, intelligence relations between ourselves, this whole belt from India all the way to Japan and all of us in between, both because of the rise of China, but also as a hedge against American abandonment and American disinterest. And the fact that we're not sure really whether we can rely on the US, and the US has become an unpredictable, actually a revisionist power today. So given that, so for me, there's hope. I'm not so sure that I like the term middle powers, frankly. But there are enough states out there with sufficient capacity to deal with the big issues. And among them, I would list developing country debt, which is very, very important. That's the one thing that would help to restore the trust that Mr. Taro just spoke of with the Global South. It's the issue that we've spoken about for a long time, but I think we can easily list the issues that really matter to us. We heard this morning, climate change matters. For us, maritime security matters. For us, I think developing country debt is something in our own interest. If we want to keep our economic interdependence and the globalized economy going, we need to deal with that. And frankly, I do think there's space for diplomacy because power is distributed. And as Gareth said rightly, there is room for decency. You know, the only thing a diplomat has, frankly, is credibility, right? And people will not believe you if you lie. It's interesting. I think it was Mearsheimer who wrote a book, Why Do Leaders Lie? It's a small little book, and it's worth reading. He studied 500 years of history, mainly European history. And he figured out that leaders very seldom lie to other leaders abroad in history. Why? Because they're easily caught out. And once they're caught out, they lose all effectiveness. Nobody listens to them anymore. And other leaders are not under their control. They lie very often to their own people, domestically, which is a whole different game. But I do believe, as Gareth said, that ultimately credibility, and that's one thing we have in the Asia-Pacific in spades. We have credibility. We have a proven economic record, and we have kept our word, all of us. So I actually am not as negative about where we're going. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult, but I do think that it's not as bad as everybody makes it sound, and as certainly it's not as bad as it looks when you look at it from the point of view of the previous hegemon.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Yes, as you mentioned, it will not be easy and it will be negative, but let's hope that we'll talk about hope again then. Dr. Marty. Marty, I forgot to mention that he's now chairman of APLN, Asia Pacific Leaders Network. It's basically promote non-proliferation in our area. Marty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm so fortunate in being able to have listened extremely carefully to the thoughts previously expressed, and I must say that much of it been said I share fully as well. If I may, in the time allotted to me, I'd like to make three basic reflections, because I have no pretense that I have any answers, to be frank. I'm just reflecting and thinking of questions in a way. And some of these reflections are based on the theme of our session this afternoon. I was rather preoccupied with the term destined for chaos and disorder. It troubles me, the term, because it suggests as if there is a sense of inability to manage matters, a sense of helplessness of even, a lack of agency, as if certain situations are not the consequence of policy decisions. I recall earlier today when Secretary General Ban Ki-moon spoke about the need to lead by example. I think policymakers have a capacity to effect change, to make a difference, to transform a vicious cycle to a virtuous one. And if I was to refer to an example, I would point to the situation in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was once a region marked by animosity, by tensions, by distrust. But through the actions of the leaders of Southeast Asia, deliberate and purposeful, we have managed to change the dynamics in Southeast Asia. Not everyone's fully satisfied how that came about, but it required the exercise of cooperative partnership, leaders who lead, who were able to take tough decisions and therefore change the dynamics. And therefore, I think in the theme of our session, one thing that we should try to do away is the notion of destined, because it does suggest as if we are in a helpless state, unable to control our own future destiny. And as I said before, ASEAN is an example of how actually a region, leaders can change in a positive way the dynamics. The second point that I wanted to share is this notion of chaos and disorder. And I can be relatively succinct in this one because all throughout today and just now, Gareth has also expressed very clearly the various elements or the various manifestation of chaos and disorder. The only question that I have along the line that Shankar had mentioned before is to wonder whether these conditions are actually new. I'm not a historian, clearly. I don't pretend that I have sufficient knowledge to have a thorough and comprehensive view. But I'm just wondering whether this era of supposed peace that we've had in the 90s, in the immediate period after the post-Cold War, whether that was simply an exception to the rule, whether actually for most of the period, epoch that we've had, it has always been a period of geopolitical competition and fragmentation. Certainly during the Cold War, for many countries in much of the world, it wasn't a cold situation. We endured a real open conflict. Southeast Asia is a prime example of how fragmented and divided we were. So I think we have to be extremely careful in reflecting back as if those were the good old days and now is terrible ones, because the Cold War wasn't cold for many of us, and even the so-called the period of stability of the 90s, post-Cold War, even then there were regions that were enduring and suffering from open conflicts as well. I say this not just simply to put things into context, that perhaps many of the solutions that we must come up with is already before us, that we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to look harder and reflect on how did we, in the past, address these type of situations in the way that we did. And the third point, as indicated in the title of our theme, the search for new regional and international order. Again, I'm thinking, again, I'm not a historian, but I'm just thinking, I suspect that the call for a new international order is not a new phenomenon. All the way back in 1955, countries, nations of Asia, Africa, came together in Bandung. They spoke about transforming the world, pushing for decolonization. And they were successful, actually, in their effort. In the 1970s, I'm of sufficient vintage to be able to recall, we spoke about new international economic order. That was the thing at the time, North-South. How can we bring about a transformation in our global architecture? New international economic order. But many of these things, we have to try to understand what were the drivers. Is it a sense that the situation that we faced at the time, the global institutions, do not reflect the need, are not seen to be fit for purpose, and therefore there is an inbuilt wish to transform, to change? But the current sudden drive for abandoning everything and looking for new order, international order, I'm a little bit careful about this. I don't have an answer. I'm just thinking out loud because I'm a bit careful because why is it that we have to drop everything because one or two countries chose not to obey international law and international order? Why should we adapt to the deficiencies and the unilateralist instinct of so-called superpower, so-called major power? I am not a great believer in the benign impact of a dominant power. It was never benign. Preponderant power, benign for the preponderant, benign for the allies of the preponderant, but it was extremely violent for those who were at the receiving end. So I'm a little bit careful when suddenly we say, oh, we should look for new international order. Why should we change the rules of the game? Because one or two, albeit important countries, decided they want to ignore it. They should be the one who adapt, not us to throw everything and as if we have to start from scratch. So I have no answer. I'm just thinking out loud, reflecting, what are the recent drivers for this sudden urgency as if we wish we need to find new international order? Even the sudden, very highly publicized and often cited speech calling on so-called middle power to come together, I have to say, welcome to our world. This is precisely what we have been doing. We don't need to create these international organizations. This has always been our lot. Countries like Indonesia, like in ASEAN countries, this is what we've been doing. We don't need big labels. We don't have to call ourselves middle powers or whatever it is, new order that we are trying to find. We practice what we believe in, developing new customs, new norms and principles and state practice. So care, I think, must be exercised in trying to jettison everything, especially when we have United Nations at the center of our multilateral worlds. And this sudden preoccupation with minilateralism as if it's something new. The UN Charter itself recognized that the UN is not the sole organization. They recognize the role of regional organizations to work hand in hand with the UN. So, let's not get too overexcited and reflect that actually, we need to have a sense of restraint and reflection on where we are. By way of concluding thoughts, if I may, Sung-hwan, this notion of international order, again, I know that throughout we use the term middle powers. I proclaim I'm not the biggest fan of it because I feel it simply reinforces the notion of a hierarchical world. There is a superpower, major power, there is a middle power, there is a small power. I believe in sovereign equality of member states, large or small. That's how I've been trained. So it becomes a self-fulfilling, but I acknowledge that there are roles for whatever it is, however you describe these countries, in the way to bring convening power, to bring, like I was about to use the term, like-minded. That's another word that I have problem with. Because if you were to apply like-minded notion to the East Asia, you will create us and them. ASEAN, I know many people there will be a session tomorrow on ASEAN, but many are quite frustrated with ASEAN. It's slow, consensus decision-making, etc. But ASEAN reflects the imperfection of our world. That's how it is. diversity and variation is a fact of life, and it's better to have everyone disagreeing and, within one common tent. I hate to see a situation for Asia Pacific where we have a situation much like, for instance, I don't want to speak ill of anyone or any region, of different camps, different security situations. Common security is our approach. So I feel that if we were to speak about an international order, and by the way, international order is not like there is a final destination. You can say, oh, finally, we've reached another order now. Let's call it whatever. Change is permanent. Whatever order you freeze frame will become obsolete from day one. So I feel that however you describe it, the order that we look forward to must have an inbuilt adaptive capacity. Powers, as many people have said, is diffused. The currency of powers is changing, and therefore we must allow issue-based type of, not quite coalition, issue-based type of convergence for us to discuss issues, discuss matters on the basis of the issues concerned. Adaptive capacity, an order that embraces diversity, embraces and celebrates diversity. Look at ASEAN. As if we don't have enough problem on our plate, let's expand it. We have East Timor-Leste now joining ASEAN. No doubt it will make reaching agreement even more difficult, but that's how our region is. Do you wish to have a perfectly efficient organization, able to take decisions very quickly, because we are so like-minded, but then outside the tent, you have other countries looking in and to say, oh, you are ganging up on us. So, as we are here in Northeast Asia, I recall the tale of two sub-regions, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. One time similarly divided by the Cold War divisions, and we are where we are in Southeast Asia, I believe, because we choose to be inclusive, to celebrate diversity rather than simply deep diving on the idea of like-mindedness. Because if you speak about like-minded, then you are guaranteeing someone else is outside. We don't need to have a common enemy to be able to be together. Unity does not mean uniformity in our language.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you for our panelists. As you hear, they provided many food for thought for us. So we'll have, actually my plan is 2 rounds of questions among us, and then I will open the floor to the audience. We'll start with common questions because our theme is about international order. So my common question is, what gives you the greatest concern? Or as Shankar mentioned, is there any hope, or if any, and about the future of our international order? Let's start again with Gareth Evans. Yeah, floor is yours. Yeah.
What gives me a lot of concern is complacency about disorder, and I heard a bit of that on the panel. I thought originally Shankar was going to embrace it to the extent of saying that resumption of conflict was no more than could reasonably be expected of the world, and we ought to just live with it. But then he came back and he said that people are beginning to realise that conflict is not all that smart. That I mean, even J.D. Vance, God help us, has recently acknowledged that. I don't normally quote J.D. Vance with any approval, but when he said last week, you can't kill your way out of solving every national security problem you have, I think that does reflect a reality that is beginning to dawn as people realise that the cost of conflict, particularly in this technological day and age where the cost, war is not something that can be conducted with minimal casualties. This is a grotesque assault on human decency and human values and human security, and it's, anyway, so that's the first concern. Second concern I have about disorder being accommodated is again from Shankar. We had a bit of a suggestion that it may be no bad thing if there's a nuclear power balance extended beyond the existing players. I mean, that's the logic of what you said. If having nuclear weapons is a serious deterrent, not to be used, but to be there as a deterrent, why the hell shouldn't Japan, why the hell shouldn't Korea go down that particular path? And that really worries me. I mean, I want to get back to what I think were some of the prevailing very serious values that were being pursued during those couple of decades when we were more optimistic. And nuclear arms control and the absolute determination not to allow weapons to go in any further than they had was one of the things that I want to recapture. I mean, coalitions of the willing are all very well again, and there's all sorts of contexts in which both in terms of gathering countries together to give deterrent signals to potential overreach by other players is a good thing. There's all sorts of other contexts in which minilateral and broader coalitions of countries can exercise real value in re-establishing genuine order. But at the end of the day, the order that we need, above all, is that's embodied in the UN Charter, that absolute prohibition on waging aggressive war. It's not just a matter of tolerating that as a kind of new reality and saying that we can just mop up the consequences with coalitions of the willing. I think we have to work hard to re-establish those basic parameters of understood taboos. And waging aggressive war was a taboo that largely held throughout the whole post-Cold War period until things started to, collapse very, very badly in recent times. And just one further point about tolerating disorder. And one of the previous things that I'd like to recapture, and not just be philosophical about its absence, is a serious willingness to address mass atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing. We are here in Jeju, after all, which 7 decades ago was the site of one of the worst mass atrocity crimes in post-war history, with 30,000 people being killed in cold blood over a period of 4 or 5 years, an orgy of property destruction, a long forgotten or long suppressed memory, but one that reminds us when we come here of just how alarming that concept of mass atrocity crimes is. We were at the stage of dealing with the inadequacies of the humanitarian intervention solution. We did get agreement on the concept in 2005 of responsibility to protect. We were showing signs of a serious willingness to implement that with fairly widespread global consensus, but that's now very largely evaporated. And that's what troubles me about accepting anything in the nature of the existing disorder. So I do want to hark back to the nostalgia of a period which we're probably overstating the extent to which these orderly values were in fact holding in the UN system. But I still think we should work very, very hard to recapture those institutional capacity and willingness of countries generally to observe those institutional constraints and realities, because that's ultimately the only way forward of really guaranteeing our security and our sanity.
Thank you. Well, Minister Kono, how about you?
Well, major concern, I think the spread of authoritarian regime. I was very impressed with what Marty said, but I think there's a like-mindedness. Democracy, human rights, freedom and liberty, there's a shade, but like-minded meaning we can enjoy the freedom, human rights, liberty, democracy, and vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes that take those away from the people. And if you look at the situation, the number of authoritarian regimes are increasing. And it's a kind of reverse trend. After the Cold War, the number of authoritarian regimes was going down, but for, I don't know, for last decade or so, it started going up. And that kind of worries me. And having said that, I was at another conference in Prague last October, and they were talking about democratizing other countries. And I think the ex-American government officials are talking about democracy. And there was a talk of like ASEAN. If you look at the ASEAN country, Brunei is a kingdom, Vietnam is a communist country, but their law-abiding regime in international society, whereas in United States, president is democratically elected, the Congress is also, and the Supreme Court justice constitutionally appointed. But they are very disruptive, and they're often ignoring international laws and norms. So going democracy, is that the goal, or that means to achieve something after that? That was a big question, and I was really thinking about that. But I think we need to stop increase in number of authoritarian regime. I think, yes, there's a line, us and them. And it's like-minded country and authoritarian regime. Yes, there's a shade in between, maybe, but I think we need to put more effort doing that. And as Gareth just said, yes, for India, nuclear weapon is to stabilize a relationship with other nuclear capability. But like Japan, Korea, we are faced with China, Russia, and maybe North Korea. If the solution is to go nuclear, yes, I hear a lot, or not a lot, but some Korean politicians are talking about nuclear Korea. And yes, there are some extreme politicians in Japan who's vying for that. If Japan go nuclear, Korea will definitely go nuclear. And then Saudi Arabia or other country, or other country in the region. And if everyone has a nuclear capability, one human error, one terrorist attack, one whatever, would destroy the planet. So I think we really need to keep on nuclear, moving for nuclear disarmament. That's something we really need to do. And this lack of international regime, if you have more power, you can create safety for your own regime, for your own country. That is not too good. So I think we definitely need to establish some kind of international order, and that should give equal rights, equal say in all the country, regardless of the economic power or population or whatever. I think that's where we need to head for.
Thank you, Mr. Gono. Well, just a follow question. I fully agree with what you have said, and you mentioned increase of authoritarian regime. And by profession, I think you are basically a politician. As a politician, what's the reason of that increase of authoritarian regime? Why people support that authoritarian regime?
It's a difficult question, but easy answer is social network. People get different ideas, sometimes totally incorrect, but that would ignite the people to go extreme. And I think if you have an extreme idea, it is much easier to accept non-democratic path to achieve the goal that you believe in. Like right now, like even in Japan, there are quite a few people or some political party who try to go anti-foreign, totally anti-immigration policy, which would never happen if there were no social network. So with social network, I think people tend to go extreme. But that's easy answer. Probably there must be deeper root for authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. Shankar, how about...
I have a lot to answer. But to your question, I think we underestimate the role of inequality, both within societies and also across globally. I think we tend to ignore it. And it's grown tremendously in the last 3 decades, if you look at it. I mean, it's a side effect of globalization and what's happened. But to Gareth's point about disorder and, you know, during the 45 years of the Cold War, every day 1,200 people were killed in armed conflict. Over 80% of that was in maritime Asia, in our parts of the world. So let's not think of some golden age where everything was peaceful and wonderful. It was neither very peaceful, nor liberal, nor very orderly for those of us in maritime Asia. It's really the last 30 years that it's post-Vietnam, let's say, that we've actually managed to keep the peace and to actually grow and develop the way we have. I'm not saying that that we're going back to that. No, what I'm saying is, if you look at it historically, we're at a period of tremendous innovation. You look at technology, you look at energy, look at the energy revolution, look at what's happening. And it happens to be that throughout history, that happens when there's disorder. It happens to go together. Today, deaths by conflict are back to post-World War II levels, which is when China was going through a civil war, when Europe was in chaos, just after World War II. Internally displaced and externally and migration refugees are again back to levels that they were at that stage. It's just a fact. I mean, so we need to deal with this. I'm not saying that we need to accept it, love it, or promote it. I'm saying the opposite, in fact. And I think we have the means today to do it. So, but unfortunately, we are so fixated on a false idea of what there was in the past, and on an idea of some liberal international order, rule-based, where, frankly, the people who ran the order didn't follow the rules, that I think we're really, that's a red herring. I think we need to deal with the situation as we see it, and I think we can. I think we have the means to, if we set our minds to it. We can develop norms, we can reassert the old norms. I think because power is distributed, there's enough of us, whether you call us middle powers, global south, whatever, major powers, whatever, there's enough of us that we can actually start. But you look at the way we reacted to the slaughter in Gaza. What did we do when Iran was attacked, when leaders were killed? If the international community is going to operate like that, then yes, you have reason to be hopeless. So there's no point saying, oh, we had good values and we need to stress our values if we behave like that. That's where I say you need to be realistic about what we see. But I think we can do it. I'm not saying it's hopeless. What are the 3 things you asked us? What are the 3 things that really bother me? As I said, number 1 is climate. Number 2 is I think we need to enforce the peace. We need to keep the peace. Now, if we can't do it globally and we think we don't have a global voice, we can't react to what we saw in Gaza and so on, do it in our regions. Do it where, in Asia Pacific at least, we can set a good example among ourselves. Do it wherever you can. Thirdly, development, because as I said, I think we underestimate what inequality is doing, both to our societies and globally. And you can't just have a little bit of the world doing brilliantly, getting richer and richer, and making money in the stock markets while half the world actually is left out of it. That's just a recipe for more disorder and more conflict and more migration and displacement. And that I don't think is what any of us want. Last point about nuclear weapons. It's for every country to decide for themselves, frankly. But my whole point is that nuclear weapons are not the answer to all our security problems, because they're not war-fighting weapons. The way I see them, they are useful against other nuclear weapons where you really think they'll be used. You know, it's interesting. In 1964, when China first exploded a bomb, we went to the Americans and the Soviet Union and asked for a nuclear umbrella and were refused. So even though we had a full fuel cycle already by 1964, we were producing our own plutonium. So each one has to make up their own mind. And depending on the situation they find themselves in. But I think the old norms of the regime are crumbling today. And it's not just Northeast Asia. You look at Europe. You have US allies, you have Nordic countries talking about depending on nuclear weapons for their security, especially when they look at a future without a plan B, a future without the US. So I think the whole thing is really up in the air, and I think we need to start, again, getting countries together and reinforcing the taboo against use, but also working towards a nuclear weapon-free world. We need to get that process going. Disarmament is not enough. You need more than arms control.
Thank you. As Gareth said, nuclear weapons are not an asset, and as you just mentioned, I hope that our North Korea fully understand that, and they will get on board together in that direction. Marty, what is your view on?
Well, if you mean by concern, I'm not going to cite some certain issues by way of concern, but more perhaps I can describe it as a systemic concern, if I may. One, systemic vis-a-vis the international order. One, I think, is the apparent inability for the international order that we have just now to deal with the reality of change. Change is permanent, constant power shifts, issue-based in general, and yet the governance, international governance, global governance, and expectation is pretty much freeze-framed. It's like set. And therefore, each time there is a rising power or increasingly prominent power is seen as being a threat, as an either or, a zero sum, a power to be contained, a power to be balanced at best. So I think we need to find ways and means to accept the reality of change, to have an international modality, international system that has inbuilt adaptive capacity. So when we think of the multilateral system, for instance, the United Nations, I'm thinking less of membership, of members of Security Council or other bodies, but more of the working methods. Basically, how can we ensure that, dependent on the issues, those who need to be in the room are actually there? I, in the past, talked about the idea of having equilibrium, a dynamic equilibrium, recognizing that power shifts is permanent, constant, and therefore you can't really balance, you can't really contain permanently without creating some pent-up dissatisfaction. But if we can come up with a notion of a bit more adaptive, flexible. Indonesia is not a significant country in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia. It's not. Objectively speaking, it's quite a large country. But we behave to a fault in making sure we exercise the maximum of restraint so that we are not seen to be acting predictably, throwing our weights around. So our size became more almost like a burden. Maximum restraint. Maximum, not even normal. We have to exercise because we need space for regional organization to find traction. But I'm not sure whether that kind of outlook is common. It's not even common in Indonesia nowadays, perhaps even. We needed to earn our leadership. Less can be more in our case. So one concern in my view, I think, is how can we think of a system, an order, if that's the term that you wish to use, that has a ability to deal with change, reality of permanent change. The second point I wanted to say is the point that I already said before, to embrace diversity. It would be such a boring world if we are all the same. We are diverse, we are varied, but it doesn't have to be divided. ASEAN is a case in point. We are, by definition, varied, diverse, and yet somehow, with our imperfection, we manage to transform the dynamics in our region. So I think ASEAN has some lessons. I don't want to say to be shared or let alone to be imposed, but certainly we have many lessons that we can reflect on in terms of embracing diversity as a strength. But it's a constant struggle, because even now, I notice, and with some despondency, that our variation has become a burden, a source of division, rather than our asset as it has been in the past. And this requires greater application of diplomacy by ASEAN member states, because in the past our diversity is our strength. Now our diversity is seen to be as our weakness and our source of liability. And the third point, in terms of systemic challenge, is the internal-external nexus. How can we, given the reality that the international and the domestic environment are interconnected, how can we ensure that they are moving in sync, in synergy? You know, I mean, all of us in this room, especially leaders, speak very eloquently about multilateralism, how strong they are in its favor. But none of us practicing diplomats at the time, now, those who are practicing, would want to have our issue multilateralized. No. We want to keep our issue to be our issue. We don't want to be interfered. We don't want to be multilateralized. And by the way, ASEAN, again, often accused of being so self-absorbed about non-interference, non-intervention. If you were to actually look at state practice in Southeast Asia, we have been some of the most open-minded countries in the world. We allowed for third-party facilitations on conflicts in Cambodia, in Myanmar to some extent. Indonesia, we have so many problems in the past and continued that we needed to engage with international parties. Southern Philippines, ICJ, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Malaysia, and now again Thailand and Cambodia bringing issues to the ICJ. In other words, we have in our own imperfect way managed to manage the external-internal nexus. And I think this is another systemic challenge that we face, because as you know, we heard earlier today with the candidates for the UN Secretary General post speaking about prevention. But prevention of a crisis, of a conflict, by definition, is before it emerges. But how can we devise a system where the engagement by the international community doesn't scare away the potential beneficiary? It's too loud. But ASEAN does things in a more informal, quiet way. So again, systemic concern, I mean, regular concern, there are many. I don't wish to add to the list, but systemic one, first, inability to manage the reality of changing power dynamics. Second, inability to deal with diversity. And this notion of like-mindedness, I have to be extremely careful, because it has the risk of further augmenting, dividing, a deepening divide. And the third one is the internal-external nexus. How can we ensure that two domains go hand in hand, intermestic? Thank you.
I made a mistake. I thought I had 15 minutes, but our staff told me we have only 5 minutes. How come? So now let me open the floor to the audience. I have very quick 2-3 questions. Please, Ambassador An. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Kono-san talked about lunch, talked about dinner, but at the same time, I should be thanking all 4 of you for this variety and diversity of food for thought, especially Ambassador MENON. And then when you talked about the return of power politics, we shouldn't be so concerned about it, in the sense that at the end of the day, it is return to normalcy or return to the norm. But at the same time, when I heard you talk about return to norm, I said to myself, I really want you to share the Korean perspective, in the sense that Korea suffered very badly on the power politics. So when we think about return of power politics, then as a matter of fact, it is with a lot of fear that I have to agree with you. I also thought about it. It is return to norm. But at the same time, if that norm means further suffering for a country like Korea, then maybe there is a need that we should be changing the norm. And you made a second intervention, and that second intervention was very helpful, in the sense that if I understood it correctly, you seem to suggest, even if it is return of the norm, then as a matter of fact, the rules can be very helpful, if I understood it correctly. And I said to myself, there were several important issues you mentioned, like maritime security or climate change or international debt issues. And quickly I went through my mind and I said to myself, maritime security, definitely law of the sea can help. Climate change, definitely Paris system can help. That issue, Paris Club, all those rules being made by the Paris Club, definitely they can help. Those ideas came in my mind before your second intervention, and in your second intervention, you seem to suggest, well, as a matter of fact, it is the return of the norm, but at the same time, we have to, well, advance ahead, and then with making necessary changes. So that, in fact, is the food for thought I got from you, but at the same time, Senator Evans, you gave a lot of help during the time I used to work on G20 issues. And Kono-san, I in fact still remember our conversation when I came to visit Tokyo sometime last year. And Marty, I have such high respect for what you have been doing as a diplomat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Dan, for your generous comments. One more question, yeah. Please. Yeah. 하나 더 아니 그 뒤에 lady first and then Mr. Kim and also then I will take 2 questions then together. Yeah.
Hello everybody, and thank you for the truly fascinating discussion so far. I'm based in Germany, Berlin, where I had work on energy security and transition. And a question I had, and I completely agree, middle powers overall is a contested concept, and it's the European or OECD countries that have actually woken up to this concept, and the rest of the world, as Mr. NATALEGAWA said, has been doing that for decades. But what we see among the OECD countries is really that trend to work on coalitions of like-minded, whether we look at supply chains, at cybersecurity, at deterrence. We see OECD countries trying to reinvent themselves without the US. So my question would be to all of you, what do you think needs to happen for this to be prevented and for those coalitions of countries, be they middle powers or others, to be a truly, a new space and a new international order that is not just OECD and the rest of the world, but something that's more? Thank you.
Thank you. Last question to President Kim of Chejonghyun Haksuron. Yes.
Thank you. My question goes to Minister Evans. So North Korea's nuclear capability now appears effectively irreversible, and for many years, extended deterrence has been the primary response available to South Korea and its allies so far. Yet, as Taro-san, as you mentioned earlier, in the absence of a viable alternative, there is a growing sense that allies may end up having to pretend to trust the United States even as doubts about long-term credibility quietly persist. At the same time, as Professor Cha Ching-guo from Peking University argued in the earlier session in the different room, opposition to South Korean nuclear armament remains firm, even though the domestic debate within Korea is gradually intensifying. So my question is, you have long argued that nuclear weapons are ultimately not usable, and I find that argument compelling. But given that logic, what do you see as the most credible long-term response for a non-nuclear ally facing this credibility gap? And do you still consider extended deterrence a sustainable doctrine in this context? This is the question. Thank you.
Okay, then Evans, you and Shankar, can you make an answer to the lady's question? Yeah.
I'm not in favour of extended nuclear deterrence because I think that is chasing a will-o'-the-wisp. I'm certainly in favour of extended deterrence if it means that countries that are vulnerable get support for conventional responses to serious existential risk from countries that are capable of giving them that support. And that doesn't necessarily just mean the United States in the context of Japan or Korea. It may mean just a coalition of like-minded, and I'll come to that in a second, countries that are willing to act together to respond to risk that is generated by someone else in their neighbourhood. So that's my answer to that. And, you know, Shankar can go on and on and on about every country making its own decision. Well, he's got to say that, doesn't he? He's an Indian diplomat. But, I mean, I do think there's a real risk. There's a real risk, which we've articulated over and over again. But so long as any country has nuclear weapons, others will want them. So long as anyone has them, they're bound one day to be used, if not deliberately, because people are waking up to the inutility of that, then certainly by accident, system error, human idiocy. And any such use would be catastrophic. And I think we just have to hang fast to that lesson. Just quickly on the issue, while I've got the microphone, I'm like-minded. I've argued for ages and ages and ages about the utility of middle powers building like-minded coalitions around particular issues. I don't mean by that like-minded in the sense of all being signed up, you know, liberal Democrats with similar cultural and value systems. I simply mean in that context, and I think we all should mean, like-minded in the sense of having a particular common interest. Whatever the nature of the political system you might be inhabiting, there can be common interests around climate change, around pandemic response, about nuclear arms control, about God knows how many other things. And we should certainly be aiming to maximise the possibility for those coalitions of like-minded interests, but not like-minded values. Diversity is a reality, as Marty keeps saying. We need to respect and live with that reality and sometimes get joy from it. But it doesn't mean that we have to have, you know, conferences of Democrats, democratic countries and all the rest of that sort of stuff that has been argued from time to time. That way lies going nuts. I mean, it's just not going to work.
Thank you. And sorry that because of my mismanagement of time, we cannot have more questions, and time is up. So we have to conclude this session. And on behalf of this Jeju Forum, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to our esteemed panelists and also our audience for joining us today. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking